So I come from former Yugoslavia, which very quickly you will hear in my accent. Even after 43 years in this country, it's still there. As soon as I say hello, people say, where are you from? So the only people who don't hear my accent are my children. So I came when I was 18, and I came to this country because I had met 2 years before an American student on a summer exchange program in Yugoslavia. And we fell in love in 1966, the summer of 1966. He came back the fall of 1967 for a Fulbright fellowship in Belgrade. I was growing up and going to high school in Niš, which is south of Belgrade in what is now Serbia. And at the end of like 3 days after I graduated high school, we got married. And 2 weeks later, I ended up in this country with my whole family back in Yugoslavia at the time. So, so that was, that was July 1968. By the end of August, we were on our way to California and continuing school training. And so then what happened was, your plans never quite go the way you make them. So 1968 was a very difficult year in this country. If you remember the spring we were planning our wedding, Bobby Kennedy was killed, Martin Luther King was killed, Vietnam was escalating. And so when we arrived, having just gotten married, my husband was 21 years old, I was 18, he had gotten a deferment from the draft to study in Yugoslavia. As soon as we arrived, there was a notice from his recruiting board, and he was basically being recruited to go to Vietnam. So he tried to claim hardship, like a foreign wife, a young wife, doesn't speak English, which was all true, but they didn't care, of course. So we continued to make plans for the possibility that he might be drafted. So one of the plans was that instead of waiting to be summoned to the Army, he actually took an exam with the U.S. Coast Guard for the reserve officers candidacy, and was one of 200 young men of thousands that took that exam that year, accepted. So within 6 months of our stay in California, we started school. He was at Stanford, I was at Foothill Junior College. We ended up, I with my in-laws in Indianapolis, where he's from, and he in Yorktown in the Officers Candidate School. And by June of that year, celebrating our first wedding anniversary, we were in San Juan, Puerto Rico. So, because that's where he was stationed for the next 3 years as a Coast Guard officer. And I went, as you may have seen in my CV, I graduated from the Inter-American University in Puerto Rico. It was not the University of Puerto Rico, because I didn't speak Spanish when I arrived there. I spoke it very well when I left 3 years later, but I did get my degree in biology, specifically in parasitology, and with a very incredible scientist, Dr. Alexander Acholonu, was Nigerian by origin, who was there because if you wanted to do parasitology, you were in the tropics, and he was in San Juan. So I took advantage of a lot of very good people, scientists, biologists, who were there, not because it was Harvard and great school, but because it was the right place to study the diseases and the biology they were interested in. So that's how I started. And actually, with Dr. Acholonu, I published the first research paper. So my first paper is as an undergraduate, and it's on completing a life cycle of a parasite. So, and then my husband was discharged into the reserves, but not from active duty, and then we flew back to Stanford and resumed our lives the way they were
Both
3
of
years
you
before.
at Stanford.
So both of us at Stanford. He continued his master's degree program that he had started just for a few months prior to having to interrupt it because of the Army. And I applied to graduate school, and then I entered Stanford Graduate School.